The humid air of the Louisiana bayou clung to Elias Greyvale's skin like a second shirt as he pulled the flatboat through the cypress knees. It was 1849, and the sun hung low, painting the water in strokes of bruised purple and gold. Elias, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, kept his eyes on the channel ahead, where the twisted roots broke the surface like skeletal fingers. Beside him, his wife Clara sat with their youngest, little Mira, nursing her against the swell of her breast. Clara's dark hair escaped its pins, framing a face etched with quiet worry, the kind that came from too many lean seasons on their patch of land. Further back, under the sagging canvas awning, Elias's brother Tom fidgeted with a coiled rope, his wiry frame taut as a bowstring. Tom was the quick one, always with a jest to lighten the load, but today his laughter felt forced, swallowed by the drone of insects. "Reckon we'll make the house by dark?" he asked, voice cutting through the stillness. Elias didn't turn. "If the current holds and the gators stay clear." He pushed the pole deeper, feeling the mud suck at the wood. The Greyvales were heading home from town, arms laden with what little they'd bartered, a sack of cornmeal, a few tins of tobacco, and the doctor's bitter tonic for Mira's cough. But the real weight was the news Elias carried unspoken. Rumors of yellow fever creeping up from New Orleans. And worse, whispers about their neighbors' well running dry, pulling folks into debts they couldn't shake. As the boat nudged past a curtain of Spanish moss, Clara shifted Mira to her shoulder, the child's tiny breaths ragged against the evening chill. "The bells," she murmured, more to herself than the men. Their family plot lay ahead, a cluster of weathered cabins ringed by oak and palmetto. But it was the old chapel bell that always called them back, hung in the belfry of the crumbling church their grandfather had built. It hadn't tolled in years, not since the fever took half the kin in '38. Yet Clara swore she heard echoes sometimes, faint chimes carried on the wind from underground like the earth itself was restless. Tom snorted, trying for levity. "Bells or no, I'm starving. Pass that cornmeal. I'll bake us flatbread on the bank." But his eyes darted to the shadowed water where ripples spread without cause. Elias felt it too, a prickle at the base of his neck, as if the bayou watched them slide by. The pole struck something solid beneath the surface, not a log but unyielding like buried stone. He hauled it free, mud dripping in thick ropes, and for a moment the world held its breath. They beached the boat at dusk, the hull grinding against the dock's splintered planks. Elias hefted the supplies while Tom secured the lines, his jokes falling flat now. Clara gathered Mira close, stepping onto the soft ground where fireflies began their lazy dance. The path to the cabins wound through ferns heavy with dew, the air thick with the scent of magnolia and decay. As they crested the rise, the house came into view, its clapboard walls silvered by moonlight, windows dark as empty sockets. Inside, the hearth flickered to life under Elias's hands, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn table. Clara settled Mira in the cradle, humming a low tune to soothe her fussing while Tom unpacked the tobacco, rolling a pinch between his fingers. "Good haul," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elias nodded, sinking into a chair, the day's toil settling into his bones. Outside, the bayou whispered secrets to itself, and far off, or perhaps imagined, a single bell note trembled through the soil, like a summons from below. Elias Greyvale wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air of the bayou clinging to his skin like a second layer of damp cotton. The plantation house loomed behind him, its white columns sagging under the weight of Spanish moss. But his eyes were fixed on the ground ahead, the fresh mound of earth where they'd buried Cousin Theo just yesterday. The boy had been only 14, taken by the fever that swept through the quarters like a thief in the night. Elias, the eldest at 22, had shoveled the last dirt himself, his hands blistered and raw. "Pa says we ought to plant something over it," murmured Lila, his sister, stepping up beside him with a basket of wildflowers clutched in her arms. She was 16, all sharp elbows and wary eyes, the kind that darted to shadows even in broad daylight. Her voice carried that soft drawl, laced with the French patois their mother had brought from the old country. Elias nodded, though his gut twisted. The ground here on Greyvale land felt wrong, always had since the whispers started after Grandpare's time. Folks in town called it cursed soil, said the bells from the old family crypt rang on their own during storms. He shook off the thought, kneeling to press a handful of lilies into the soft earth. "Flowers first, then we'll see about a stone." As his fingers sank into the dirt, a low vibration hummed through the soil, faint at first, like the distant rumble of thunder over the levee. Lila froze, her basket tipping slightly. "You feel that?" Before Elias could answer, the earth shifted. Not a tremble, but a deliberate pulse, as if something beneath pushed back. Dirt cascaded from the mound, revealing a sliver of pale wood from Theo's coffin. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs. He lunged forward, scraping at the soil with his bare hands, the metallic tang of fear rising in his throat. "Lila, get Pa!" But she was already running toward the house, her skirts whipping behind her like flags in a gale. The vibration grew, sinking with a muffled chime that echoed up from the ground, clear, insistent, like a bell tolling from the depths. Elias dug faster, nails breaking against the wood, his mind screaming that it couldn't be, that Theo was gone, peaceful in the earth. Yet the sound persisted, a single note repeating, pulling him deeper into the unearthed hollow. By the time Amos Greyvale arrived, lantern in hand despite the midday sun, the mound was half ruined, and Elias sat back on his heels, chest heaving. The old man, broad-shouldered still at 50, though his face was etched with lines from too many lost seasons, knelt beside his son, peering into the exposed crack. The chiming had stopped, leaving only the cicada's drone and the lap of the nearby swamp. "What in the devil's name?" Amos muttered, his voice rough as gravel. He wedged a stick into the gap, prying gently. No movement, no sound. Just the quiet finality of death. Elias met his father's gaze, the words sticking in his throat. "It rang, Pa, like the stories. From underground." Amos's eyes hardened, flicking toward the distant tree line where the family crypt squatted, half sunken into the boggy earth. Built by their ancestors before the war with the British, it was a relic of stone and iron, its bell tower long collapsed. "Stories are for children and fools," he said, but his hand trembled as he covered the spot back over, patting the dirt firm. "We'll say nothing of this to your ma, or the hands. It'll pass for settling earth." Lila hovered at the edge, her flowers scattered forgotten on the grass. She hugged her arms tight, whispering, "Theo ain't restin'. Something's calling him back." That night, as the family gathered for supper in the dim parlor, the air thick with the scent of gumbo and unease, Elias couldn't shake the echo in his bones. The windows rattled faintly with a breeze that carried no relief, and outside the bayou whispered secrets to the gathering dusk. Amos ladled stew with forced steadiness, but his jokes fell flat, and Lila picked at her food, eyes on the floorboards as if expecting them to shift. Elias pushed his bowl away, the vibration from the grave replaying in his mind. He slipped out to the porch, the wooden slats creaking under his boots. The moon hung low, silvering the cypress knees that jutted from the water like skeletal fingers. In the distance, from the direction of the crypt, a single bell tolled, soft, deliberate, cutting through the frog chorus. He gripped the railing, knuckles white. It wasn't imagination. And if it was calling for Theo, what else might it summon from the Greyvale earth? The lantern in his hand flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cypress roots that twisted up from the mud like skeletal fingers. Beside him, his wife Clara gripped the edge of the skiff, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. Their daughter, young Mira, huddled in the center, her wide eyes reflecting the dim light as she clutched the frayed doll to her chest. The boy's absence weighed heavier than the heat. Thomas had vanished 2 nights prior, his cries echoing from the earth like a plea swallowed whole. "We shouldn't have come back out here," Clara whispered, her voice barely rising above the chorus of frog croaks and distant owl hoots. She glanced at the ground where the soil seemed softer than before, as if the land itself had exhaled. Elias said nothing, his jaw set firm. He'd buried his doubts with the family's dwindling hope. The bells had rung again at dusk, faint but insistent, tolling from beneath the plantation's old chapel grounds. Not the wind in the chimes, no. These were deeper, muffled by dirt and decay, pulling at memories of the fever that had claimed half the parish last summer. Mira shifted, her small boots sinking into the boat's damp floorboards. "Papa, do you think Tommy's down there?" Like the stories Mama tells about the old mines, her words hung in the air, innocent yet laced with the fear she'd absorbed from their hushed arguments. Elias knelt beside her, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He's not in any mine, darlin'. We're just making sure the ground settled after the rains. Folks hear things in the swamp, echoes that play tricks on the mind. Hose off the water." But even as he spoke, his hand trembled on the oar, the lye tasting like brackish water on his tongue. They pulled deeper into the overgrowth, the skiff scraping against submerged logs. The chapel ruins loomed ahead, its bell tower a splintered silhouette against the moonless sky. Vines choked the stone walls and the air grew thicker, carrying a faint earthy rot that made Clara cover her nose. Elias tied off the boat to a low-hanging branch, the rope whispering as it coiled. "Stay close," he murmured, lifting the lantern higher. The light caught something unnatural. A patch of earth near the foundation disturbed with fresh divots like claw marks etched into the mud. Clara froze, her breath catching. "Elias, look, those weren't there yesterday." She pointed, her finger shaking. The divots formed a rough circle, centered on a rusted iron grate half buried in the soil. Its bars warped as if something had strained against them from below. Mira whimpered, pressing closer to her mother's skirts. Elias approached, heart pounding in rhythm with the unseen bells that now seemed to pulse in his ears, a low vibration humming through the ground. He knelt, peering into the darkness beyond the grate. The lantern's glow revealed only blackness, but then a glint. Metal, perhaps a buckle or a coin, winking back from the depths. Before he could speak, the earth groaned. Not a crack or shift, but a deliberate rumble like breath drawn from lungs of stone. Dust sifted from the grate, and Clara yanked Mira back toward the boat.
"We need to go now!"
Elias hesitated, his fingers brushing the cold iron. For a split second he swore he heard it. A child's voice, faint and garbled, calling "Papa" from the void. The vibration swelled, shaking loose pebbles that pattered like rain. He recoiled, stumbling into Clara's arms as the skiff rocked violently. They pushed off frantically, the pole slipping in Elias's sweat-slick hands. The rumble faded as they retreated, but the bells resumed. 3 tolls, slow and mournful, echoing from underground as if the land itself were grieving. Mira buried her face in Clara's lap, sobbing softly, while Elias stared back at the ruins. The glint in the darkness burned into his mind. Whatever lay beneath had stirred, and Thomas's absence felt less like loss and more like a summons. The bayou swallowed their lantern's light, leaving only the stars to witness the family's unraveling resolve. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the root-choked tunnel. The air down here was thicker than gumbo left too long on the stove, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like rusting iron. He'd been digging for what felt like hours since the last bell tolled, his spade biting into the soil with a rhythm that matched his pounding heart. Beside him, young Theo hunched over a makeshift brace, his small hands trembling as he wedged a splintered plank against the crumbling wall to keep the ceiling from caving in. "Pa, you hear that?" Theo whispered, his voice barely cutting through the muffled drip of water somewhere ahead. Elias paused, ear pressed to the dirt-smeared wall. Nothing but the faint scrape of his own breathing. But Theo's eyes, wide and shadowed, told him the boy wasn't imagining things. The bells had started again last night, faint chimes echoing from beneath the old family plot, pulling them both from uneasy sleep in the overseer's shack. Mama Greyvale had sworn it was just the wind through the willows, but Elias knew better. Those bells hadn't rung since grandfather's time, when the yellow fever took half the parish. He nodded curtly, resuming his dig with renewed fury. "Keep that brace steady, son. We're close." The tunnel they'd followed from the root cellar sloped downward, narrower than a coffin, forcing Elias to crawl on his belly for the last stretch. Theo, barely 12 and wiry as a sapling, had insisted on coming, his cautious nature overridden by the stubborn bravery that mirrored his father's. But bravery didn't stop the mud from sucking at their boots, or the chill that seeped into their bones, no matter how many layers of homespun they wore. A low rumble vibrated through the ground like thunder trapped underground. Elias froze, spade mid-swing. Dust sifted from above, pattering onto his shoulders. Theo's breath hitched. "It's them," the boy said, not a question. Elias didn't need to ask who. The stories whispered around the Greyvale table, about the family bells rung by the dead to call the living down, weren't just tales to scare the help. Last spring, when Cousin Harlan vanished after a fever dream, folks said he'd heard them too. Now, with the plantation's debts mounting and the river floods washing out the crops, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the bells were calling for payment. He struck something solid, the spade clanging against metal. Heart leaping, he scraped away the soil, revealing a rusted iron grate, its bars twisted like gnarled roots. Beyond it, darkness swallowed the lantern light, but a faint glint caught his eye, a chain dangling into the void. Theo edged closer, his wit surfacing in a shaky quip. Looks like the devil's jewelry box, Pa. You reckon it's full of gold or ghosts? Elias forced a grim smile, prying at the grate with his tool. It gave with a groan, hinges protesting like a dying man's rasp. Neither, boy. Just answers. But as he widened the gap, a draft rose from below, carrying not just cool air but a whisper. Soft, insistent, like wind through bells. Theo recoiled, clutching the lantern. The light danced, illuminating faint scratches on the bars. Names. Etched deep, Greyvale, Harlan, and lower. Fresher, Elias. The rumble returned, stronger this time, shaking loose pebbles that rained down. Elias hauled Theo back just as a crack spiderwebbed across the tunnel wall. We go slow, he muttered, voice steady despite the dread coiling in his gut. But slow meant time for the whispers to grow, threading through the dark like smoke. They weren't alone down here. The bells rang on, muffled but relentless, urging them deeper into the family's buried secrets. Elias glanced at his son, saw the fear mirrored in those young eyes, and pushed forward anyway. Some debts couldn't be outrun. Elias Greyvale wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows on the tunnel walls. The air down here was thicker than swamp fog, laced with the metallic tang of earth and something sweeter, like overripe fruit left to rot. He'd been digging since dawn. His calloused hands blistered anew each time the shovel bit into the clay. Beside him, his sister Clara knelt, her fingers sifting through the loose soil they'd unearthed, her face pale under the grime. She was the cautious one, always had been, whispering prayers under her breath when their father wasn't looking. Nothing yet, Clara said, her voice a thread in the heavy silence. She glanced up at him, eyes wide with that familiar mix of hope and fear. Pa says the bells are closer today. You hear them? Elias nodded, though he hadn't admitted it to her before. The ringing had started faint, like distant church chimes carried on the wind, but now it pulsed through the ground, a low vibration that set his teeth on edge. Their father, Jeremiah, had sworn the family fortune was buried here beneath the old plantation. Gold from the war years, hidden when the Yankees came calling. But Elias wondered if it was the bells calling them, not the gold. A rumble echoed from deeper in the tunnel, and Clara froze. Elias gripped the shovel tighter, his heart thudding against his ribs. Just a cave-in settling, he muttered, but his voice cracked. He stepped forward, the lantern swinging, illuminating veins of quartz that gleamed like teeth in the dark. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. We should go back up. Ma's waiting with supper, and the doctor's due any day now for her cough. Her words were practical, but her hands trembled as she clutched the small silver cross around her neck. Elias hesitated. Jeremiah had forbidden turning back until they hit pay dirt, his eyes wild with the fever that had gripped him since the letters from New Orleans stopped coming. One more foot, Elias said, driving the shovel in. The earth gave way easier than before, crumbling like dry bone. That's when the bells rang clear, 3 sharp tolls as if pulled by invisible hands. The sound wrapped around them, not from above, but rising from the depths, pulling at Elias's chest like a hook. Clara gasped, stumbling back, her lantern clattering to the ground. Flame danced across the floor, and in its light, Elias saw it. A glint in the soil, not gold, but something smoother, whiter. A bone, human-sized, protruding from the wall like a forgotten root. Lord have mercy, Clara whispered, crossing herself. She reached for his arm, but Elias couldn't move. The bells tolled again, slower now, and the tunnel seemed to breathe, the walls pressing in with a damp sigh. He dropped to his knees, prying at the bone with his fingers. It came free with a wet snap, dust billowing up. Carved into its surface were faint marks. Letters, maybe, or symbols that twisted like vines. This ain't right, he said, voice hoarse. Pa never mentioned bones. Clara's face hardened, her caution turning to resolve. We tell him now. No more digging till morning. She grabbed his sleeve, pulling him toward the rope ladder that dangled from the surface. But as they climbed, the bells followed, muffled but insistent, and Elias felt a chill settle in his marrow. Up above, the Louisiana night pressed down. Stars hidden by moss-draped oaks and their mother's silhouette waited at the cabin door, her cough rattling like an echo of what lay below. The bone weighed heavy in his pocket, a secret tolling its own warning. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the damp earth. The pit they'd dug behind the old smokehouse was deeper now, 3 feet into the loamy soil that clung like wet clay to their shovels. Theo knelt at the edge, his small hands gripping a rusted bell cord they'd unearthed earlier that evening. its tarnished brass humming faintly in the humid air. "It's like the ground's breathing through it," the boy whispered, his voice steady despite the fear etching lines around his eyes. Lila shot him a warning glance but said nothing, her own spade biting into the dirt with renewed force. The bells had started again at dusk, a muffled tolling that vibrated up from the roots of the cypress trees, pulling them back to this forsaken corner of the property. Mira huddled against the sagging fence, her shawl wrapped tight, eyes fixed on the widening hole. She'd argued against coming out here after dark, her cautions falling on deaf ears as Elias insisted they couldn't wait for dawn. Not with the sounds growing louder, more insistent, like a summons from below. Now as clods of earth tumbled into the pit, a sharper note rang out, close enough to rattle the loose pebbles at their feet. Lila paused, shovel midair, her breath catching in the thick moss-scented night. "Listen," Theo said, dropping the cord and leaning forward. The family froze as the tolling shifted. No longer random peals but a rhythm. Slow, deliberate, like knuckles rapping on a coffin lid. Elias felt it in his chest, a pressure building as if the bayou itself were exhaling secrets long buried. He grabbed the lantern and lowered it into the pit, its light revealing twisted roots snaking through the soil like veins. There, tangled in the mess, was another cord, frayed and leading downward into blackness. "We pull it," he murmured, his voice rough with resolve, though his hands trembled as he reached for it. Mira's protest came sharp and urgent. "Papa, what if it's not just bells? What if it's them calling us down?" Her words hung in the air, laced with the dread she'd carried since finding the yellowed journal in the attic, its pages filled with scrawled warnings about the Greyvales of old and their morbid custom. Bells for the living dead, strung from graves to spare the mistaken from eternal silence. But Elias yanked the cord anyway, the soil shifting with a groan. For a moment, nothing. Then the ground shuddered, a low rumble rising as dirt cascaded into the hole, forcing Lila to leap back. Theo shouted, scrambling away as the pit widened, swallowing the lantern in a spray of mud. In the sudden dark, the bells crescendoed, a chorus now, echoing from multiple points beneath their feet. Elias clawed at the earth, pulling Theo clear, while Lila dragged Mira from the collapsing edge. They stumbled back toward the house, hearts pounding in sync with the underground clamor. The night alive with the scent of unearthed decay. Something had answered their digging. Not freedom, but a deeper trap. The cords now taut, as if whatever lay below gripped them in return. As they barred the smokehouse door behind them, the tolling didn't stop. It followed, faint but relentless, seeping through the floorboards like a promise of pursuit. Elias Greyvale wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the tunnel walls. He'd been descending these passages for what felt like hours, though his pocket watch had stopped at midnight. Beside him, his sister Clara clutched the rope ladder they'd rigged, her knuckles white against the frayed hemp. She was the cautious one, always had been, but tonight her eyes burned with a resolve that scared him more than the darkness. "We shouldn't have come alone," Clara whispered, her voice echoing faintly off the roots that snaked through the ceiling like veins. "Father's map led us true, but what if—" A low toll reverberated through the stone, not from above but from deeper in, a bell's mournful peal that vibrated in their chests. Elias froze, his hand tightening on the shovel. It was the third time since they'd broken through the false floor in the old root cellar. Each ring seemed closer, pulling at him like a tide. "It's them," he said, more to himself than to her. "The family legend. The Greyvales buried with their secrets, bells tied to their fingers to signal if they'd been planted alive." But that was old wives' talk meant to ward off grave robbers. Or so he'd thought until the ring started 2 nights ago, right after the storm unearthed that peculiar slab in the bayou. Clara stepped forward, her boots squelching in the mud. She was braver than she let on, the one who'd convinced him to dig when the rest of the household dismissed it as swamp gas or fever dreams. Their cousin Thibodeau had laughed it off, calling it hoodoo nonsense, but he'd stayed above ground with the lantern fuel, nursing his flask. Down here it was just them against whatever stirred. "Listen," she said, pressing her ear to the wall. The tunnel curved ahead, narrowing into a black maw where their light barely reached. Another toll came, slower this time, like a heartbeat fading. Elias swung the lantern higher, illuminating a scatter of bones half buried in the silt. Small ones, bird-like, but too curved for any fowl he'd seen in the fields. His stomach twisted. The map, yellowed and brittle from their father's attic trunk, had marked this as the Whispering Vein. a forgotten branch of the underground rivers that honeycombed the plantation since the Spanish days. But the bells, they weren't on any chart. He hefted the shovel, driving it into the soft earth with a thud that sent echoes skittering. Dirt cascaded down, revealing a glint of metal, a chain perhaps leading nowhere. Clara grabbed his arm. Stop, feel that? The ground hummed beneath them, a subtle tremor that raised the fine hairs on his neck. It wasn't an earthquake. Louisiana had those aplenty, but this felt deliberate, like fingers brushing the world's underbelly. She pulled a small crucifix from her pocket, the one Mother had worn until the yellow fever took her 5 years back. If it's the dead calling, we answer careful. No rushing like fools. He nodded, but his mind raced. The family had secrets piled higher than the cotton bales, debts to New Orleans lenders, whispers of dealings with the overseers that went beyond the legal. And now this, bells ringing from below as if the ground itself accused them. Another peal swelled, closer, wrapping around their legs like cold water rising. Elias dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with bare hands. Something solid met his fingers. Not bone, but wood, splintered and inscribed with faded letters. Jar Ey, Clara gasped, her light trembling as it caught the edge of a coffin lid, half askew in the collapse. It wasn't their father's, too small, too old. The bell chain dangled from within, slick with moisture, still quivering from the last toll. Inside, shrouded in decayed silk, lay a figure not fully skeletonized, its hand outstretched as if reaching up. The eyes, hollow sockets, but Elias swore they followed him. Stared with an emptiness that promised more graves ahead. They backed away, the tunnel seeming to contract around them. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts. We tell Thibodeau. We seal this up and pray. But Elias knew better. The rings wouldn't stop, not until they unearthed the truth or it unearthed them. The final toll lingered, a dirge that seeped into their bones as footsteps, soft padding, echoed from the curve ahead. Not theirs. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flame flickering like a dying heartbeat against the damp tunnel walls. The air down here clung to his skin, thick with the scent of earth and something sharper, like rusted iron. He'd promised Mira they'd turn back at the first sign of trouble, but the bells had rung again. 3 sharp tolls echoing from deeper in the labyrinth, pulling him forward like an invisible tether. Theo trailed close behind, his small hands gripping a coil of rope, eyes wide but mouth set in that stubborn line that mirrored Elias's own. Pa, you think it's them? The ones the stories talk about? The boy's voice was a whisper, cutting through the drip of water somewhere unseen. They'd come this far chasing whispers of the family's past. The Greyvales who'd built their fortune on these bayou mines before the fever took them. At first they thought it echoes from the chapel ruins. Then Theo vanished for a night, returning with soil under his nails and a tune on his lips that no child should know. The plan to seal the tunnels had backfired in the depths. When the mimic, whatever spectral hunger dwelled there, clawed free, its form shifting like smoke through the roots, wearing the face of Elias's drowned brother. They'd barely escaped. Clara's quick thinking with the salt and iron from the smokehouse buying them time. Now with the last of the dynamite from the mill rigged and buried, the air hummed with anticipation. A low rumble stirred the ground, faint at first, like thunder rolling in from the Gulf. Theo whimpered, pressing closer to Clara. It's angry. Papa, it's calling me again. Elias knelt once more, not to dig, but to listen. The bells didn't ring. No, this was worse, a vibration that climbed through his bones, whispering promises of reunion in the dark. He thought of the cost. The plantation lost to collapse, the family's name whispered as cursed from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. But they'd adapted, clever in their desperation, using the bayou's own waters, diverted through the passages with makeshift dams, to drown the thing's lair. Light it, Elias said, his voice a gravelly command. Clara handed Theo the lantern and struck the match, her hand steady as she touched it to the fuse snaking into the earth. The spark hissed, racing downward like a serpent into the void. They ran then, not looking back, the 3 of them weaving through the cypress knees toward the flatboat moored at the dock. The explosion came muffled, a deep groan from the ground that shook leaves from the branches and sent ripples across the water. Dust billowed up behind them, carrying the faint final peal of a bell, twisted, fading into silence. As they pulled away into the mist-shrouded bayou, Elias felt the weight settle. The mimic was gone or buried deeper, but the land would remember. Theo hummed softly now, A lullaby without words, and Clara's hand found Elias's in the dark. Freedom tasted of mud and salt, but the bell's echo lingered in their blood, a quiet toll for the lives remade. Mira had begged Elias to leave it buried, but the letters from New Orleans, debts piling like storm clouds, had driven him here. Now, with Lena's cough worsening above ground, the bells felt like a curse mocking their desperation. Elias knelt, tracing the faint etchings on the wall. Names, dates, a crude bell sketch. Could be. But we're not digging for ghosts today, son. Just answers. He straightened, ignoring the ache in his knees, and pressed on, the tunnel narrowing until shoulders brushed stone. The path split ahead, a fork shrouded in shadow. Theo tugged his sleeve. Left or right? Remember what Ma said? Follow the air. Elias nodded, feeling the faint breeze from the right, cool and insistent. They veered that way, footsteps muffled by the soft sludge underfoot. But as they rounded a bend, the rope snagged on a jutting root, yanking Theo back with a yelp. Elias spun, heart pounding, and hauled the boy free, only to see the line frayed, half unraveled in the dim light. Damn it, he muttered, knotting it hastily. No time to waste. The bells could stop any moment, and with them their only lead. Deeper in, the walls wept condensation, forming rivulets that snaked toward their boots. Elias's lantern caught a glint, brass half buried in the floor. He scraped it free, a small bell, its clapper tarnished but intact. Theo's breath hitched. Pup, it rang. I heard it. Elias hadn't, but the boy's fear was real, eyes darting to the darkness beyond. He pocketed the find, urging them onward. But doubt crept in like the moisture. What if Mira was right? What if this place wasn't hiding fortune, but something hungrier? The tunnel widened into a chamber, stalactites dangling like jagged teeth overhead. In the center, a collapsed shaft yawned, its edges crumbling. Elias peered down, the lantern beam swallowed by blackness. Faint vibrations hummed through the stone. Another ring? No, just his pulse thundering. Theo pointed, voice trembling. Look, marks on the wall. Like hands. Elias followed the gesture. Scratches, desperate and deep, climbing upward as if something had clawed for escape. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a mine anymore. It was a grave. They edged closer to the shaft, Elias uncoiling fresh rope to test the drop. We'll lower just enough to see. Tie it secure, boy. Theo nodded, lashes wet with unshed tears, but his fingers worked the knots true. As Elias rappelled down, the walls closed in, the air turning stale, laced with decay. 10 feet 20, the beam caught cloth snagged on a spike, faded gray fabric from another era. He reached for it, and the rope groaned, fibers snapping under sudden strain. The world tilted. He plummeted, lantern shattering on impact, plunging him into void. Pain bloomed in his leg as he hit uneven ground, the dark absolute now. Theo! His shout echoed, unanswered at first. Scrambling, he fumbled for the spare flint in his pocket, striking sparks until a meager glow bloomed from a twist of rag. The chamber below was a tomb. Bones scattered, bells clustered like offerings at an altar of stone. And there, in the corner, eyes gleamed. Not human, but something watchful, stirring as his light danced. Above, Theo's voice cracked through the gloom. Pa, hold on, the rope's gone. Elias's mind raced. They were cut off, the bells silent now, but the scratching began, faint from the walls drawing nearer. He gripped the bone nearest him, a makeshift weapon as the thing in the shadows uncoiled, its form whispering of the Greyvale's buried sins. Elias Greyvale wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air of the bayou clinging to his skin like a second layer of grief. The lantern's flame flickered in the still night, casting long shadows over the mound of fresh earth they'd just piled high. His hands, caked with mud, trembled as he set the shovel aside. Beside him, his sister Clara knelt, her dress soiled and torn, whispering prayers that dissolved into the chorus of crickets. The bell, that cursed hollow thing they'd unearthed from the collapsed tunnel, lay silent now at the base of the grave, its tarnished brass glinting under the moon like a false promise. We couldn't leave it down there, Clara said, her voice barely above the rustle of Spanish moss overhead. Her eyes, red-rimmed from days without sleep, fixed on the mound. The sounds, they were calling to us, to Mama, to Papa. If we bury it deep enough, maybe it'll stop. Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him sharper than the mosquitoes. The family plot had been their sanctuary on the edge of the plantation, a place where the sugarcane fields gave way to the twisted roots of cypress trees. But since the flood 2 weeks past, When the Mississippi had swollen and swallowed half the land, strange echoes had risen from the ground. Bells tolling from nowhere, faint at first like wind chimes in a storm, then louder, insistent, pulling them back to the old slave quarters where the earth had split open. He'd gone down first, rope tied around his waist, into the fissure that yawned like a wound in the soil. The air below was thick, stale, carrying the scent of damp rot and something metallic. Blood, perhaps, or the tang of fear long decayed. His lantern had caught the glint of the bell, half buried in a chamber of roots and bones. Human bones arranged not in rest but in supplication, fingers curled as if grasping for the surface, and scratched into the clay wall, faint but legible, Greyvale, 1792. Their name, their bloodline, etched by hands that weren't theirs. Now, as the first drops of rain pattered against the leaves, Elias felt the ground shift subtly beneath his boots, not the settling of new dirt, but a tremor, like a heartbeat stirring awake. Clara gasped, clutching his arm. "Did you feel that?" He froze, listening. The crickets had gone silent. From beneath the mound came a low hum, vibrating up through the soil, building into a single resonant clang. The bell. It rang once, muffled but unmistakable, as if struck by an unseen hand. Elias's stomach twisted. They'd bound it with chains from the barn, wrapped it in oilcloth, and weighted the grave with stones from the riverbed. Yet here it was, defying them. "Run," he whispered, but Clara shook her head, her caution giving way to the stubborn resolve that had always defined her. She grabbed the shovel, stabbing it into the earth with frantic swings. Dirt flew in clumps, the rain turning it to slurry that slid back into the hole. Elias joined her, his muscles burning, the metallic taste of panic flooding his mouth. The ringing grew steadier, a dirge that seemed to pulse in time with his own veins. By the time they hit the oilcloth, the storm had unleashed in full, sheets of water blurring the world into shades of gray. Clara peeled back the covering, her face pale as the bell emerged, chains intact but quivering. No hand had touched it. The surface was etched now with fresh scratches, their initials E and C carved deep as if by claws from below. The final toll reverberated through the air, louder than thunder, and Elias swore he heard voices in it, layered and pleading. Family long lost, calling them home. They didn't rebury it. Instead, Elias hauled the bell onto the cart, Clara securing it with ropes that bit into her palms. The horse nickered uneasily as they turned toward the house, the bayou swallowing their lantern's light. Behind them, the grave yawned empty and the ground whispered promises of more to come. The bells weren't done ringing. They were just beginning to name their toll. Elias Greyvale gripped the lantern's handle so tightly his knuckles blanched against the flickering light. The tunnel's damp earth pressed in from all sides, the air thick with the scent of rot and something sharper, like iron-tanged blood. Behind him, Thomas stumbled, his breath's ragged echoes in the narrow passage. "Father, we can't keep going like this," the boy whispered, voice cracking. "Those bells, they're louder now. It's pulling us deeper." The chimes had started as a faint tolling weeks ago, seeping up from the plantation's boggy fields like a forgotten dirge. Elias had dismissed it at first, blaming the wind through the willows or the slaves' superstitions. But Clara's screams that night, when the ground beneath their bed shuddered, had changed everything. She'd vanished into the earth, swallowed by a fissure that sealed as quickly as it opened. Now, with Eliza clutched in his other arm, her small body trembling, eyes wide and unblinking, they descended into the underworld that had claimed his wife. A low rumble vibrated through the walls and Elias halted, raising the lantern high. Shadows danced like specters across the clay, revealing roots that twisted like veins. One bell tolled clearly then, resonant and mournful, not from above but ahead, as if the earth itself mourned. "Quiet," Elias murmured, though his heart hammered. He wasn't a superstitious man. Born of Virginia gentry, he'd built this Louisiana holding with sweat and ledgers, but the weight of the unseen pressed on him now, heavier than the mud caking his boots. Thomas edged forward, his youthful bravado frayed. "Remember what the old cook said? The bells are for the ones we buried without names. The chains." He trailed off, glancing at Eliza, who clutched a locket to her chest, the last gift from Clara engraved with a tiny bell. The boy had always been the dreamer, sketching maps of hidden bayous in his journals, but down here his words felt like warnings. Elias shook his head, pushing on. The passage widened into a chamber, its floor uneven with pooled water that reflected the lantern's glow like shattered mirrors. Bones lay scattered there, yellowed and cracked, some still linked by rusted iron. Not animal, human, Elias knew with a sick certainty. The bells rang again, a chorus now emanating from fissures in the far wall. One split open as they watched, exhaling a chill mist that carried whispers faint and overlapping. Names, pleas, fragments of songs in a tongue Elias half recognized from the quarters. Eliza whimpered, burying her face in his coat. "Mama's there," she said, voice muffled but sure. Elias knelt, pulling her close, his free hand brushing the cold stone. He'd come for Clara, driven by a father's desperation and a planter's guilt, the land's dark history he'd ignored for profit. But the bells weren't calling her back. They were summoning judgment. Thomas knelt beside a cluster of bones, tracing a shackle with trembling fingers. "These aren't just graves. Look, the engravings." He held up a fragment, lantern light catching faint script. Dates, initials, bells etched as if to mark the silenced. The tolling swelled, vibrating in their chests, and the mist thickened, coalescing into shapes. Translucent figures emerging from the walls, eyes hollow, hands outstretched. Elias stood, shielding his children. "We face it together," he said, voice steady despite the dread coiling in his gut. The first figure reached for Eliza, its touch like frost on her skin, and she cried out. Thomas swung the lantern, shattering the apparition into wisps, but more came. Their bells a cacophony now, drowning out the drip of water. They backed toward the tunnel, but the ground buckled beneath them, a chasm yawning wide. Elias grabbed Thomas's arm, hauling him from the edge as Eliza slipped toward it. Her small hand caught a root, dangling over the abyss where the bells rang purest, a void pulsing with light. "Papa!" she screamed, and in that moment Elias saw Clara's face in the depths, not lost but waiting, her expression a mix of sorrow and accusation. With a grunt he lunged, gripping her wrist and pulling with all his strength. Thomas braced against him, and together they dragged her up, collapsing in a heap as the chasm sealed with a groan, silencing the nearest tolls. But the whispers lingered, and Elias knew the bells wouldn't stop, not until the Greyvales paid what the earth demanded. Bruised and breathless, they crawled back the way they'd come, the lantern's flame guttering low, casting long shadows that seemed to follow. Elias gripped the lantern's handle so tightly his knuckles ached, the flame flickering against the damp walls of the tunnel. The air down here grew thicker with every step, laced with the metallic tang of old earth and something sweeter, like overripe fruit left to rot. Theo walked just ahead, his shoulders hunched, whispering curses under his breath as he prodded the ground with a rusted iron bar they'd scavenged from the attic. "This ain't right, Pa," he muttered, voice echoing softly. "Those bells, they're closer now, like they're laughing at us." Clara trailed behind, her skirts muddied to the knees, one hand clutching Lila's arm while the other pressed a damp cloth to her mouth. The girl's eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the shadows that seemed to shift just beyond the light's reach. They'd come this far, chasing the sound that had plagued the plantation for weeks, those tolling bells, muffled and insistent, pulling them from their beds at midnight. Elias had thought it a prank at first, some neighbor's spite, but the ground trembled with it, and the family Bible spoke of old promises buried deep. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them single file, the ceiling brushing Elias's hat. He called out to Theo, "Keep steady, boy. We're past the fork now. Map said the chamber's just beyond." But doubt gnawed at him. The map, yellowed and brittle from his grandfather's trunk, had led them true until the last turn, where the passage split like veins in a leaf. They'd chosen left on a hunch, the bells guiding like a siren's call, but now silence pressed in, heavier than the dirt above. A low chime vibrated through the stone, faint at first, then swelling into a chorus that rattled the lantern glass. Lila whimpered, pressing closer to Clara. "Mama, it's them, the ones who never left." Clara shushed her, but her own breath came ragged, memories of her own grandmother's tales flooding back. The Greyvales who fled the fever in New Orleans, burying their dead in haste beneath the fields, with bells tied to their fingers so the living could hear if they stirred. In case of mistake, the stories went. But mistakes had piled up over generations, and now the bells rang without cease. Theo swung the bar at a loose cluster of roots snaking from the wall, dislodging a shower of soil that dusted his face like ash. "See, the ground's given way. If we don't find the source soon, it'll bury us all." He glanced back, his usual wit sharpened by fear into something brittle. "Pa, you sure this ain't just chasing ghosts to prove you're the man of the house?" Elias shot him a look, but the words stung. The plantation's debts mounted, the crops failed under unexplained blight, and these bells had become his obsession, a way to reclaim control. "We're ending it tonight," he growled, pushing past to take the lead. The tunnel dipped sharply and his boot sank into softer earth, pulling with a wet suck. He yanked free, heart pounding as the bells tolled again, closer as if summoned by his defiance. They emerged into a wider space, the lantern casting long shadows across a chamber pocked with shallow graves, wooden markers splintered and illegible. In the center a pit yawned, ringed by rusted chains that dangled like forgotten prayers. The bell's source was clear now. Tiny clappers within, attached to skeletal hands protruding from the soil, twitching faintly in the draft. Clara gasped, covering Lila's eyes, but the girl peeked through her fingers, transfixed. "They're waking," she breathed. Theo knelt at the pit's edge, peering down into blackness that swallowed the light. "There's more below, layers of them. Pa, we can't just—" His voice trailed as a hand, fleshed, pale, clutched at the rim from the depths, nails scraping stone. Elias froze, the iron bar slipping from Theo's grasp to clatter into the void. The bells erupted in frenzy, a cacophony that shook dust from the ceiling. And Clara screamed as the ground beneath her buckled, a fissure snaking toward them like a vein bursting. Elias lunged, grabbing Clara and Lila, hauling them back as Theo scrambled away. The chamber groaned, walls weeping moisture, and the hand withdrew with a slick sound, pulling something heavier behind it. A figure shrouded in sodden cloth, rising inch by inch. "Run!" Elias bellowed, but the exit tunnel behind them collapsed in a rush of earth, sealing them in with the ringing dead. The air filled with the scent of decay, sweet and choking, as eyes, milky, unseeing, gleamed from the pit's edge. Clara clung to Lila, whispering frantic prayers while Theo fumbled for the dropped lantern, its light dancing wildly. Elias faced the rising shape, his brave facade cracking as the bells tolled his family's name. Underground and unending. They were trapped, the weight of the past pressing down, and for the first time he wondered if some debts weren't meant to be paid. Elias Greyvale knelt in the damp earth of the family plot, his fingers caked with mud that smelled of iron and decay. The night air hung heavy, laced with the distant croak of frogs from the bayou. But closer now, the silence pressed in like a held breath. Behind him, Clara clutched the lantern, its flame flickering low, casting shadows that danced across the fresh-dug mound. Little Theo huddled against her skirts, his small hands twisting the hem of her dress, eyes wide but unblinking. Too young to cry anymore, it seemed, after the things they'd seen. The bells had stopped tolling an hour ago, or was it 2? Time blurred down here in the hollows of Louisiana's underbelly, where the Greyvales had buried their secrets since the fever took their kin in 42. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, smearing it with grime, and glanced at the wooden cross he'd hammered into the soil. It wasn't for the dead, not the ones above ground anyway. This was for what lay below, the thing that mimicked their voices, that rang those cursed bells from the tunnel snaking beneath the plantation. "We can't stay," Clara whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her grip on the lantern. She'd always been the cautious one, the one who mended nets and planned harvests while Elias chased whispers of old Creole magic. But tonight caution had sharpened into resolve. The others will come looking. The hands from the quarters, the sheriff from town, they'll hear the stories, piece it together. Elias nodded, rising slowly, his knees protesting the dig. The external threat had started simple enough. The sinkhole that swallowed Old Man Duval's cart, revealing the labyrinth of forgotten slave passages beneath their land. But it wasn't the earth giving way that chilled him. It was the bells pealing from the dark, calling names of the long gone.